one of the first conversations I ever had with Luria was right there in Red Square when he was talking about when he and his group first put forth a proposal that went to the Minister of Education, it was, or the Minister of Science, I can't remember which, for a grant, which was the start of what he described as the battle for consciousness, or the battle of consciousness, I don't know which way to put it. I was fascinated by this story. He said we didn't know, for example, whether the next day we would get a letter acknowledging the draft, or whether they would say they're going to take us off and throw us out, and that kind of thing. And it was so interesting because we then, this was at a meeting in Moscow, I think it was the first time. And then after that, we started corresponding a great deal. I was corresponding with him also, and I realized that we'd talk about anything in the correspondence, but I realized that one of the things that he was telling me about was a battle for consciousness in Russia, the parallel of which was starting in the United States in the Center for Cognitive Studies, which hadn't yet got started, but we were somehow wanting to get back to a notion of mind. This case being George and me, although I don't think George and Luria knew each other particularly well or got on. But I think Luria also sensed that we were up to that, so that a lot of our first conversation was about the business of freeing psychology from a sort of mechanism. Now, as I think about it in retrospect, I realize that to some extent, the two of us, each in our own way, were responding to something interestingly common in the world. He was responding to the communist sort of ideology of man as kind of somebody who was a robot, to get something back into the robot that somehow could fit into a system. And my pals, including you as a young guy, were responding to a kind of capitalist Taylorism in the world of making man fit into slots that was supposed to fit into an industrial system. And each of us, in our way, were communicating about that. And it was interesting, the extent to which, in our context, whether I was visiting with him in Moscow or the rest of it, it tended to be not just about psychology, but about the symbolic world. We both shared a certain amount of interest in art, film, and theater, and that kind of thing. And his interest in Stanislavski and the rest of it like that, and the method, made me fully aware of two things about him which I thought were absolutely fascinating. One of them was the role of symbolic processes, and the role not only of symbolic processes, but as we would now say years later, of going meta on your own thoughts and making a symbol of it. And he thought of that as the arts, and the way in which somehow you create objects of art, or plays, or theater, and so on. The way, for example, in the Alexander Nevsky film, for example, you have the hordes coming across the ice on the lake, or in the Potemkin film, you have people coming down the long stairway, and that kind of thing, representing a symbol of people rising, and the rising was based on consciousness along the way, and that sort of. There was that element, and there was the other element that was in it that was a very, very strong one, was a notion somehow of individuation. And this was part of the business of going meta. That is to say, you were the master of going meta on your own thoughts. And it was for this, I think, that he loved the frontal lobe work, because it was the frontal lobe that provided the basis for doing this. When, for example, we first started working with children in Cambridge, I have to say, we were corresponding at a hell of a rate. I was amazed, I hadn't gone back over them yet, but I was amazed that the gal who was up in Cambridge found 100 letters. I had no idea there were that many, back and forth thing. He was strong on the business of being aware of the fact that what it took to use the old Vygotskian zone of proximal development was a sort of not only that there be an abstract kind of thing, but that there was an act involved. He was very much an active. There was an act of turning around on your own knowledge and making it into, how to put it, the next stage. But that was that part. And the one last thing I want to say is that during the period when we in the midst of correspondence, he was very much a sort of kind of a, well, kind of a father figure, to put it like that. He was sort of a perfect father figure in a way for me. I think you might know something about that too, but he was accessible, warm. He was kind of the Jewish intellectual father. I was the son, and he was looking for figures of that sort. But during that same period, it was interesting because I was also corresponding, not as much and not as personally at all, with Piaget and with Sir Frederick Bartlett. And I realized that to some extent now it was the odd kind of a thing about they're looking for some sort of a break in the overall sort of behaviorist facade of American psychology, and they were finding it in people like me, and in Don Hebb was another one with whom they were in correspondence, and Carl Priebrem a little bit later. But I had always thought of that as an interesting kind of thing in which two things, and I'll come to one a little bit later, but I'll just mention it, two things distinguished Luria from, certainly, and I'll take Piaget as the example. Piaget was rather threatened by Luria. One of them was the sense of the cultural thing. One thing that Alexander Romanovich never believed in was a kind of the invariant growth of mind without respect to the culture, the kind of Piagetian stages. He didn't scorn it, he just laughed. He said, it must be awfully comfortable for people to have a point of view like that. So there was that. That was one of the kinds of things that he did like that. And the other thing that he particularly was funny on the subject of Piaget was the fact that there was no way in which the child ever seemed free to reflect in a way which was au-delà, so to speak. Reflection was the term that he liked, do you remember? But it was what we now call going meta. He liked Bartlett for his thing like that, but so far as I know, I don't think he and Bartlett did they ever meet?
I doubt it.
I doubt it very much, and if they did, it would be hard to imagine the two of them in conversation. A prototypical Brit.
Right. Let me ask you a question, because one of the first published pieces of yours that commented on the general ideas was the preface to Vygotsky's Thought and Language, which was published at MIT in 1962.
Yeah.
How did that come about? How did it come about that you wrote that preface? And was this Luria arranging things?
Well, it was Luria arranging things, but I also have to mention the fact that there was somebody who acted as a mediator in that, who was, what was her name again?
Eugenia Hoffman?
Eugenia. Eugenia Hanfmann. There had apparently been some, and Roman Jakobson as well entered into the thing like that. Apparently, there was some funny kind of a business as to who was going to write the introduction, and was it not, or the preface or whatever, was it not at one point the case that Luria was going to write a commentary? Not Luria, I mean, Piaget was going to write a...
There was a Piaget commentary.
That was a Piaget commentary, and it was a slip-in.
Right.
It was a slip-in thing. It was to be part of the book, and it was to be the thing like that. Apparently, as I remember it, Roman Jakobson read the thing, and in the fullness of his Russianness, if I can put it that way, went into a very stagey Russian rage. I love Russian rages are wonderful. It's one of the reasons why Russian theater is great. It's a cultural form, and I'm sure that Roman was completely in control of everything like that. So how could you get a major thinker like Vygotsky to write the thing, and then ask somebody who holds a completely different view to write an evaluation, and then put it in as a blah 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 blah. You know. So it was at that stage again that I don't know how it came about that they asked me to do the thing at this point, but there it could have been Eugenia's idea. There it may very well be that Alexander Romanovich said, "Why don't you get Bruner to do it or something like that?" Do you know any more than that?
No, I was just curious.
I don't. You know.
Just curious. I'm going to turn to Oliver, and we'll come back and maybe get a little dialogue going, because Oliver, the earliest correspondence we have, I think, between Jerry and Alexander Romanovich was from 1958. I believe that's...
Was it from 58?
I think it was from 58. Maybe 56, but 58. Certainly about that period. And your correspondence with him began in a quite different way, your interaction with him.
Right. I'd been fascinated by him for years, especially by The Mind of an Eminist, which came out in '68 in English. But then when The Man with a Shattered World came out in '73, I think late '72, I wrote a review of it, which also became an essay on Luria. And this was published in June of '73, which was the same month as my book Awakenings came out. And then the following month, I got one of these wonderful envelopes from Moscow with beautiful stamps, and
He was a great stamp collector.
and Luria's handwriting. I was very excited. It was like getting a letter from Freud.
Yeah.
And he sent me first a very long letter in response to my essay, which really spoke of many aspects in his own life, and how separate he felt from both the Pavlov and Skinner, and from mechanical thinking, how important for him it was to see things in terms of social development, so that there was never just an autonomous child, there was always a mother and child, there was always a dialogue. And well, he spoke of many things, including his including the way in which Pavlov responded to Luria's own first book, The Nature of Human Conflicts, when Pavlov refused to read it and said, "You call yourself a scientist?" I mean, it was a wonderful open letter, and then a week after that I got another letter about Awakenings. And so this was the start of a correspondence which went on till Luria's death in '77. But I never met him. I don't know what inhibited me from going to Moscow, but the correspondence then ramified in different directions. Early on, he hoped one might republish in English some of the classics in Russian, neuropsychology, and Sechenov, and some works by his own father, R.A. Luria. In 1974, when I had my strange leg accident, and with a feeling of alienation in the leg, I wrote at length. I found this unintelligible, and I couldn't communicate with anyone except to Luria, and I wrote to him then, and there was a lot of correspondence about this, and he, which especially had to do with the nature of action and body image, and how something could be excluded from body image or alienated if it wasn't active. And I wondered whether I should write about this or not, and he finally got so enthusiastic, he sent me a telegram from Moscow saying, "Do it." And you can quote my letters if you want to. In the '75, I started to see a patient with Tourette's syndrome, and I sent Luria some tapes of this, some audio tapes, and he was fascinated and thought there were some similarities between the mental processes of the Tourette and his mnemonist. He partly saw this as mnemonism in action. Duncan Dallas, a filmmaker, hoped to make 3 documentaries, one with Luria, one with Skinner, and one with me. He made the documentaries with Skinner and with myself, but by that time Luria was feeling too ill, I think, to contribute. Occasionally completely different things would come out in the letters. One of them was his fondness for detective stories. And I sent him a number of those. I think
he was a terrific admirer of American detective stories and English detective stories.
I think the one he liked most was the Sherlock Holmes one, the 7% solution, which imagines Sherlock Holmes as a cocaine addict being analyzed by Freud. Luria loved that.
Right.
I sent him all the Niall Marsh books, I remember. 5
Yes, he especially asked, I think, for Nicholas Freeling books
Yeah,
from me.
yeah,
Yes,
those
right.
favorites. Yeah.
Right. To what extent, you're one of the few people who write about Luria and his notion of romantic science. And I'm curious about the sort of initiation or the cause-effect or relationship between your ideas on this topic and his. How did that come up in the correspondence?
The early Luria I read was very different. I think the first Luria I read was the probably in the late 50s, was the nature of human conflicts, and in particular the way in which someone with Parkinsonism who could not take a step by himself could organize movement by using a higher cortical mechanism. And since I had seen this constantly among my own patients, but this was the first consideration I had seen. Then in the mid-60s, Higher Cortical Functions was published, and somehow the stultifying sort of phrenological neurology, which I had been taught, could be replaced by this wonderful notion of functional systems with different components, and that seemed to me very, very exciting. But then an entirely different sort of excitement came in when I saw The Mind of an Eminist. I read the first 30 pages thinking it was a novel. And then I realized it wasn't a novel, but a wonderful case history with all the accuracy of science, but all the sensibility and drama and structure of a novel. And I think I'm sort of a storyteller myself, or rather I have a storytelling impulse, which sometimes seems to compete with the analytical impulse. But certainly seeing The Mind of an Eminist, I think, fortified me in my own feeling that I had to attempt some similar sort of portraits of my own patients, which is what I did in Awakenings. I love Victorian case histories and their richness of detail and their insight and their human character. And I had been feeling that neurology was becoming very desiccated. And in Luria's romantic case histories, I had the feeling that the richness of 19th century naturalism was recovered, along with a sort of functional analysis which was completely new and which could take everything to a higher level. So I was thrilled by this.